Good evening, everyone. Good evening. And welcome to this new first lecture in our series that is called Just on the Edge. Now, Newhall Murray Edwards has a history of being on the edge because back in the sort of mid-2000s, Bernie Balkin, who might be here somewhere, I think he's coming tonight, ran a whole series here called Environment on the Edge. Then just a couple of years ago, we started a series which was called Capitalism on the Edge, and I suspect some of you are attendees of some of the lectures that we had on that set of talks. And for those of you who are interested, those talks are all now out in a very nice book, which will be on sale afterwards outside at £5 a time, actually. And it's got fantastic lectures in from all sorts of people about many of the issues about capitalism, ranging from what companies should do, what the finance sector should do, through to what it means in terms of inequality and so on. So a real mixture of things. But we thought we'd have a rest after Capitalism on the Edge, and it's 2 years, and then just restarting now. And we called it Just on the Edge because it feels like an awful lot of different things horribly on the edge. And it gave us a chance to look at a range of issues. And for those of you who see the programmes coming up, we will be covering quite a lot of very contentious and, sort of issues of the moment, really. The next one is about a new economics, donut economics, being presented by a woman called Kate Rayworth. We have one after Easter called Peak Youth, because there are 1.8 billion young people aged 10 to 24 in the world, and it's still increasing. And what does that mean for the world? And then at the beginning of next term, we will start on the truth question. So there's quite a range of issues about what is on the edge. But tonight, we are reverting to really the environment and climate change, because that truly is on the edge. And I've got some fantastic speakers, and the main speaker is Tony Juniper, who I'll introduce now, and then we've got a discussant who I'll introduce, who's going to give a 10-minute reflection on this after Tony's piece, and then we'll open up to all of you. But Tony Juniper and I have known each other for quite a long time. I was at Oxfam, and he was at Friends of the Earth. And he was one of the ones who worked very avidly to persuade the development sector that they ought to take an interest in climate change and the environment. And we did, I hope we did, and recognise how much it was affecting poor people. Tony's gone on from there to continue campaigning, but to be a writer and a sustainability advisor. And in particular, he's the special advisor to the Prince of Wales's International Sustainability Unit. He's done loads of other things. He's a fellow at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and many, many other things. And he's very active still in writing and, as I say, advising and really moving this whole sector on. And I'm amused to learn from him today that he's actually now going back to the NGO world, to World Wildlife Fund, which is fascinating. So without further ado, I'm going to let Tony get in and talk about Just on the Edge and in terms of climate change and human beings in this world. So, Tony.
Thanks, Barbara. Thank you very much indeed, Barbara. It's an absolute pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you all so much for coming. I'm going to speak this evening on the theme of the Anthropocene. And if the slides will come here. How do we do this? Here comes somebody, a bit of technical support. Just while we're on that, so I've been at WWF for 2 weeks and 2 days, so I'm still working out what's going on, but very much still in the zone of trying to do something about some of the issues I'm going to explore this evening. And I'm going to bring an idea of the Anthropocene towards the end of the lecture, and just to set out some of the thinking about the extent to which humankind is now the most pervasive and single most influential factor shaping outcomes on planet Earth. My slides will draw on some of the drawings in this book that was published in 2016, what's really happening to our planet, and hopefully can paint a vivid picture of some of the important changes taking place. And I will talk first of all about some of those changes that are leading us into this idea of the Anthropocene, some of the impacts of that, and then some of the ways in which we might want to be thinking about the future. So the drivers of change, first of all. What might we consider to be some of the big factors shaping the changing character of our world? I think if you think about it for a nanosecond, you might come up with this: the rapidly increasing human population. At the time of the Battle of Trafalgar in the early 1800s, the human population was about 1 billion. By the time my mother was born in 1928, it had doubled to 2 billion. Coincidentally, the same moment when penicillin was invented, thereby leading to increased survival from disease, to the point where it reached 3 billion in 1960, the year I was born, doubling again by 1998 to reach 6 billion, going over 7 in 2011, and reaching 7.5 billion in April 2017. And of course, it continues to go up. The shape of the curve is uninterrupted. We're going to hit at least 9.5 billion by mid-century, possibly 10 or 12 by the end. We simply don't know. And of course, the factors behind this are complicated. I mentioned medicine and more comfortable conditions, and that, of course, is adding not only to the effects of people having children, but also to the effect of us living longer. In the 1950s, the average global age for a citizen of the world was late 40s. By the 1980s, it reached the 60s, and now going up towards 70. Obviously, big variations globally. In some parts of the world, we live an awful lot longer of that. But we've reached the point where we can convey this remarkable statistic. 2/3 of all the people who've ever been 65 in the history of humankind, going back tens of thousands of years, are alive today. We have a bulge of elderly people on the earth. And of course, this is causing big challenges alongside high birth rates in some developing countries. In the developed nations, we have increasingly elderly population. Percent change in the working age population between 2010 and 2050. Some countries, as Barbara was saying, have a huge population of young people. The working population is going to be expanded massively. Many, many more jobs needed in countries like Saudi Arabia, whereas in countries like Japan and much of Western Europe, we're going to be needing to find the means to support an increasingly elderly population on a smaller base of workers. What's the solution to that? Well, in both cases, countries tend to talk about that, economic growth. And we've been pretty successful in being able to foster this over the last decades. And indeed, whilst the population has tripled since about the 1950s, the size of the economy has grown about tenfold. So the economic growth is going faster than the population growth. And over here you can see one effect of that is that per capita income globally, the average of that has about tripled between 1960 and 2010. We're getting richer. And of course, that increase in income is not simply a matter of everybody sharing the wealth out equally. Some countries have grown more rapidly than others. This just gives you a sense of the per capita GDP in 2014 compared with 1990. The difference between the circles gives you a sense of how quickly countries have expanded their wealth. Some of those in Asia, hugely bigger in terms of their per capita income compared with some countries, traditionally strong industrialized nations, Japan, USA, UK. They've still increased their income but at a lower rate. The effect of this is to see this kind of change taking place, whereby in 2030 it's expected that something like a half of the middle class income in the world will be amongst what are presently deemed developing countries. If you look back to the 1960s, 2/3 of the world's middle class consumers were in the United States and EU. A massive change. Consumption patterns now emerging along European lines and North American lines in the Asian democracies and indeed non-democracies, which are growing very rapidly, both economically and in terms of their population. And of course, as we'll come later on to understand the impacts of this, the more middle class people there are, the more impact on the environment. And of course, it's not simply a question of everybody getting on average richer. The income disparities are really quite staggering as we look at the way in which the benefits of that economic growth are being distributed. So whilst people are creeping out of poverty and some emerging into middle-class lifestyles, it is the case that about 60 people in the world control the same wealth as the poorest half of humanity. Really quite a staggering statistic, and that number drops year on year. Population growth economic expansion, wealth creation, in large part driven by progressive urbanization. Another characteristic of our modern world is the rapid movement of populations from rural areas to urban centres, to towns and cities. We passed the point in about 2007 where for the first time in human history, more than half the population of the world lived in urban areas. Every moment up until that point, more than half of humankind, and until this period down here, many more than half of humankind were living in rural areas. Now, this is important not only from the point of view of people changing their lifestyles, but also in changing their impact. When people move to cities, it's an engine of economic development. They tend to have more income, which leads to increased demand for natural resources. This little diagram gives us a snapshot of one city, London. This was a piece of work done for the Mayor of London back in 2006, just sets out the footprint of the city in terms of the area of land needed to keep it going. This is based on the idea of a global hectare, and a global hectare is the amount of land required to sustain a particular style of consumption or to absorb the waste, the carbon dioxide and other wastes generated by the way in which people live. And you can see here, this is the actual size of London. That's the global hectares needed to keep London going, about the size of Spain, when you take account of the materials and waste it demands and generates, the food it needs, the energy, transport, the water, and the impact it causes on land degradation. So over here you can get a sense of what cities look like if all the people in the world lived in one city. The density of Paris, that's what it would look like on the lower 48 states in the US. If it was the density of San Francisco like that, or Houston like that, but actually the bit that's often hidden, and which we don't see in terms of the land demanded by cities, is the footprint from what they're consuming. So although more and more of us are moving to cities, thereby depopulating rural areas, the footprint of people is going up. And one of the elements of the footprint, of course, is the energy that we need to sustain those cities, the electricity, the heating, the transportation. And you see this kind of curve in terms of global primary energy demand. You can see the mix over here in terms of the way in which that's changing over time. But actually the thing to begin looking at in these graphics now is the way in which they're all taking off at about the same time in the period just around the middle of the last century, after the Second World War. You can see graph after graph beginning to take on this kind of dimension. And of course, we can expect these to be projected into the future. Demand hasn't stopped. Economic growth and population growth are continuing. To give you these kinds of estimates, 1990, 2030, the International Energy Agency setting out its expectations in terms of primary energy demand, pretty much doubling in that 40-year period. And as you can see, the three big layers in these projections are fossil fuels going out to 2030. These data are now a few years old, and fortunately, what we're seeing in practice is a different pathway being adopted. But nonetheless, the momentum behind the level of demand in the world at the moment is absolutely colossal, including in relation to energy. Alongside energy, perhaps the other major sector that is causing impacts to the state of our world is in relation to our food supply. This gives you a little sense of grain production going back to 1950, the period of the so-called Green Revolution down here. New crop technologies, pesticides, fertilizers, machinery, industrialization, irrigation, helping to kickstart this period of steady growth in the output of food, meeting the demands of a rising population. And actually it's very interesting looking at this kind of graphic and just understanding the technological triumph that's been created here and how that managed to ward off what in the 1960s was seen as potentially a Malthusian catastrophe as more and more people overwhelmed the ability of the world to feed them. And, of course, we've managed to keep pace, more or less. There's issues of hunger in some parts of the world, and I'll mention those in a second. But, of course, it's not simply a question of keeping pace with demand in a linear way. We've actually put accelerators on the amount of natural resources needed to feed us by moving towards more meat-rich diets. So those middle-class consumers in the Asian countries and other parts of the world are adopting patterns of preferences similar to ourselves and going from predominantly vegetable and plant-based diets to eating more and more meat. And these proportionately are the kinds of differences you see in terms of land, energy and water compared to a pound of soy compared to what you need to make a pound of beef. Whether it's a plant-based diet or an animal-based one, we've put a lot of technology behind this nutritional surge that we've created, including a vast quantity of fertilizer. This gives you a little sense of the growth and indeed plateauing of fertilizer use globally. Just get a sense of the regional differences here. The reason why we're using less fertilizer at the global level is the collapse of the Soviet Union, right there, and also Europe becoming a little bit more efficient through rules adopted in the European Union to be more efficient with how we're using nitrogen in particular. But this is a colossal quantity of material being produced with a really massive greenhouse gas footprint and also wider environmental consequences, as a lot of these fertilizers leak from fields and into the marine environment and into aquatic systems. And on top of that, of course, the environmental impact of our food supply has been considerably deepened through the rapid increase in the quantity of pesticides being used globally. You can see some of the regional differences down here, but if you look at the global picture, you see really quite a staggering increase in the quantity of toxic materials being deployed to kill insects, fungi, and various plant diseases. For all this, of course, we still know that there are issues in the world with the number of people who are malnourished. This gives you a little sense of where they are. They're in Latin America, Africa, but particularly in Asia. And this, I think, has less to do with the amount of food the world is producing compared to some deep social challenges. And I think in this part of the world, in Asia, a lot of what you see there is down to poverty, whereas a lot of what you see in Africa is down to poverty and also down to politics in terms of why people still don't have enough to eat. In a world that's wasting 1/3 of its food, this is not to do with the quantity of nutrition that's being produced. It's to do with some deeper challenges. You get a sense up here of the possible impact of money. In the United States, people spend about 6% of their average household income on food from a base of about $32,000, whereas in India, it's about 1/3 of the money is being spent on food from an average household expenditure of $620. These are the issues that lie behind some of the challenges in terms of global nutrition. It's interesting when you look at this kind of thing and understand why these kinds of numbers are still there, and then we hear, actually, the answer is more technology. Is it really? Maybe come back to some of that later on. Actually, the big threats to food security in the future, I would say, are not down to technology, but down to something much more fundamental. This is a little map giving you some sense of regional differences in terms of soil damage. Soil is one of those things we hardly ever talk about. You hardly ever hear it mentioned by a politician or a major corporation. This is what feeds us, and we're damaging soils globally at a terrifying rate, and the principal reasons are down to agriculture. Varies in different parts of the world. Up in the Fens in East Anglia, where we live right now, you go up there and the peat soils, which have been feeding us for the last several hundred years, they're now nearly exhausted. In some places, we're down to the marine clay that lies underneath. We're using soils as though it's a resource to be mined, not something that can be infinitely sustained and renewed. And obviously, this will have major consequences for food security and also, indeed, major consequences for global politics. This little map just sets out some of the trends in terms of global land deals taking place over recent years. Countries that are importing land by hiring land in other countries, leasing or taking control of, are in grey. Exporters of land, countries that are allowing their agricultural estates to be turned over for production to feed other countries, are in the other colours, and you get a sense of how big they are in terms of that particular trend. This is countries beginning to reflect some of the issues of the global tensions arising between the natural resource base and increasing demand for food. And actually, this really took off in the wake of the global food price shock in 2008, 2009. You may remember that in the headlines. Many reasons for that, including drought, a spike in fossil fuel prices, but also some countries unable to increase production, those in the Middle East, those in Europe, where there's a high density of people and not enough farmland to feed them. So something to keep an eye on as we go further into the Anthropocene. And of course, it's not just for soils that people are taking control of land in other countries, it's also for rainfall, another fundamental that we hardly hear much about in terms of the threats to our world, but actually the demand for water has, of course, rocketed alongside demand for food and industrialization, and you see again another curve taking off its inflection point in the middle of the last century. This is mostly for agriculture. Well, there's plenty of water in the world, isn't there? Well, there is. Trouble is, most of it's salt water. 97% of the 1.4 billion cubic kilometres of water in the world are salt. 2.5% is fresh water. And if you look at the distribution of the fresh water, 2/3 of it is in glaciers and 30% of it's in groundwater. Some of that groundwater is very deep and hard to get. That's the liquid water. So when you look at that last graphic back there, that curve is basically drawing on that. And that's the basis of our agriculture, industry, and everything else. So for food, energy, land, water, obviously the tensions are increasing, as indeed they are for other natural resources. This little graphic just gives you a sense of demand for the combined tonnage of fossil fuels, metals, ores, and biomass globally. Again, you can see another curve kicking off here in the middle of the last century and heading very steeply northwards. This one's particularly steep, takeoff of manufacturing and middle-class consumption in Asia. Up here, you can see another dimension of the inequalities embedded in all of these curves. This is the share of global private consumption that is for the richest 20% of people in the dark and the poorest 20%, that little sliver there. Huge disparities in relation to various metals there. And of course, this is not only the environmental impact that is an issue. A little survey here from the US Geological Survey, estimates as to how much we have left in terms of known ore bodies for various things that are vital for various industrial sectors. This one's quite interesting. We're about to electrify the world's car fleet. A great deal of copper is going to be needed for that. One wonders what the effects of that will be in terms of driving mining activities into some of the world's most important remaining areas for biodiversity. And what are we doing with those raw materials? Well, we're wasting most of it. A great deal of that goes into the bin in different ways, or into the ocean in the case of plastics, or into the atmosphere when we burn it. Just a little graphic there to give you some sense of the scale of waste generation that is accompanying that upturn in the consumption. All this is happening at the time when we are becoming more and more connected. Global internet use. You can see here, very steep curve. I remember back in 1996, first mobile phones with internet capabilities. I was working at Friends of the Earth at the time and had some people in our IT department said, we're going to get a website. I said, why? They said, we have to communicate with people. It will never catch on, I said. Let's spend the budget on leaflets. Look what happened. And the number of devices that are connected to the internet similarly exploding way faster than the population growth. And we're not only connected by devices and by technology in the form of internet-connected technology, but also, of course, aircraft. Just give you a sense of how much more we're flying as a global society. In 1970, 310 million, tenfold that number now. The aircraft manufacturers putting an awful lot of effort into making the aeroplanes more efficient. Good for them, a great job, and they are doing some incredible things. But compared with 1960, the amount of fuel we're using has been cut by 2/3, whereas the scale of growth in the industry has grown tenfold. If you speak to the aviation sector at the moment, people like Heathrow Airport and others who are planning for the future shape of their industry, they believe that by 2050, we are going to have between 3 and 7 times more flights than we have now. And the aeroplane technology is not going to be able to keep up. So all of this is adding up to really what you might call a global economic explosion, isn't it? Infrastructure, connection, consumption, rising incomes. And the reason we've been doing this is to cut poverty. That's what that economic growth has been all about. If you listen to the political discourse going back over recent decades, we've been trying to get the number of people living in absolute poverty to drop. And we've been quite successful at this. If you look at some of the indicators that have come from different bodies monitoring social progress over recent decades, they can paint quite a good picture in terms of access to fresh water, safe fresh water for people to drink, education, some health indicators, connections to electrical power, and this one, the most fundamental of all, poverty. Still big bodies of poverty in the world, but this is a good news story. What actually, of course, this has added up to is, whilst on the one side a reasonably positive social story, notwithstanding those economic disparities, but on the environmental side, actually really quite a terrifying story. And that's what I'm going to come to next, some of the consequences of those curves I showed you a second ago. Perhaps most familiar to many people in the popular discourse is the impact we're having on our atmosphere. That orange and yellow curve tells you of the changing concentration of carbon dioxide in the Earth's atmosphere, principally coming from the combustion of fossil fuels, and you can see it's really a very dramatic change. Over here, that same curve stretched out to 10,000 years, and you see that we're now up at just over 400 parts per million. In fact, when this graph was drawn a few years ago, it was just under. Now it's over. And it's going up at 2 to 3 parts per million per year. This change here is staggering in an historical sense. Colleagues at the British Antarctic Survey here in Cambridge, taking ice samples from the deepest ice on the modern Earth, have managed to analyse atmospheric samples, taking direct measures of the air going back 800,000 years. And at no point does it go above about 280 parts per million. What we've done is literally unprecedented in human history, and obviously is already leading to a series of impacts in the world. These are extreme weather, sea level rise, changes to seasonal patterns, and all linked to rising global average temperature. And we carry on designing infrastructure as though nothing is happening. It's really quite bizarre. Why would you build something 50 centimetres above sea level costing many billions of dollars? Some people still seem to think that we don't have a problem. We do. And the question now is not so much whether there's a link between rising greenhouse gas concentrations and consequences for the way in which our atmosphere works. The question now is, at what point do we need to limit the warming in order to avoid the worst of this? And many of you paying any attention would have heard that the world has adopted the goal of limiting the warming this century to below 2 degrees compared to the pre-industrial period. If you want to make targets like that, broadly speaking, you can come up with an idea of how much carbon you can release before you trigger that level of warming. We're already just over 1 degree. We reached that point in 2016. We're committed to further warming because the pollution we're releasing today is getting into the atmosphere and will create warming later on over the next half century or so. So we're already committed to more. And as a result of having already used up 545 billion tonnes of our carbon budget, leaving this bit here, we've got that long left if we carry on burning at the current rate. We plateaued a couple of years ago in terms of global emissions. If we carry on at that plateaued level and don't increase, we've got until about 2045 before we go zero carbon. That's not a bit more efficient or a little bit less polluting, zero carbon. And that's at about the time when we might wish to have increased the number of flights between 3- and 7-fold. You get the idea that there's a slight tension here. If you wish to save the world's coral reefs and you wanted to limit the warming to below 1.5 degrees, that will still have a big effect on the reefs actually, but it'll give you more of a chance of saving some of them. Then we're looking at the early 2030s, at which point we need to be zero carbon. This poses some really quite challenging arithmetic to key economic sectors. So if you take that carbon budget and you look at what we've got left, and then you compare that with the fossil fuel reserves that we're currently taking out of the ground and which we know we've got to draw upon in terms of the coal reserves, the gas we know we can get out, and the oil we know about in the North Sea and everywhere else, never mind looking for any more, which is what people are still doing. If you turn this into the carbon budget, we can take about 12% of the coal, about half the gas, and 2/3 of the oil to remain within a plausible chance of having a 2-degree outcome. Of course, this is not how the world is behaving at the moment, because if you start to take this seriously, then this poses a massive economic shock, because most of the world's stock markets, including the London Stock Exchange, are valued in large part on this stuff. If you say it's got no value, then this has huge fundamental implications for the way in which our societies work. But it's what the science is telling us. And the reason we are focused on 2 degrees is in part because of the potential for the climate system to start behaving in ways that could be very disruptive for the way in which the Earth works as a result of so-called feedbacks apart from anything else. As you warm the atmosphere, there is decreased rainfall in the Amazon in some of the models. As a result of the modelling and indeed events in the real world, the rainforest begins to die back. As the rainforest dies back, it stops sucking CO2 out of the air and starts to release it instead. And as it does that, there are fewer rainforest trees to absorb CO2. You get more warming, and so the cycle continues. You can say the same about seabed methane release, permafrost melting, and the melting of the ice in the Arctic, removing a white surface and replacing it with a dark one, which is absorbing more of the sun's energy, thereby melting more of the ice at the top of the world. This is one reason why the 2-degree limit is so important. And you look at some of the little things that are creeping into the literature, little things, actually huge things like this. The Amazon drought of 2010 caused dieback of vegetation, releasing carbon equivalent to that of the entire Chinese economy. So while we're on the subject of forests and dieback, bear in mind that one of the consequences of the way we're carrying on right now, of course, is to demand more land. This is rather an arcane measure. Human appropriation of net primary production just gives you some sense of how much land we've been using up. It's actually levelled off in some part because of the way in which we've intensified agriculture. But of course, the demand continues as we seek out more land upon which to grow food, including for livestock. Actually, as I was researching this, it's up here where this really caused me to stop and think. And the more I think about it, the more I fear that this is actually more indicative than anything else that we can look at in these graphics. This gives you land and air vertebrate biomass. So this is animals, birds, mammals, reptiles, living on land, breathing air, and their biomass, the weight of them. And 10,000 years ago, the weight of the air-breathing animals on the Earth, 99% of it was wild animals. Fast forward to today, and humans and their domestic animals account for 96% of the air-breathing higher animal biomass. That's staggering, isn't it? I sat and I checked this several times. I thought, this cannot be right. Then go for a walk in the Cambridgeshire countryside and see what you can see. A few starlings, some people and their dogs, some horses, some cattle, some sheep, wild animals. You might see a couple of deer. And if you just do some mental arithmetic in your 2 or 3 hour walk, you might find that you disappointingly have seen much less than 4% wild biomass. And of course, that and this together are being accompanied by the changing to the vegetation globally. This just gives you a little sense of the shift from temperate deforestation more recently to tropical deforestation, the paler colours. Tropical deforestation has tailed off a little bit in some parts of the world in recent years, and one of the reasons for that in some geographies, of course, is that there's no forest left to clear, including in parts of West Africa, whereas actually there is some positive political action in some other places. Another graph that gives us cause to pause as to what the message is the global fish catch. Again, looks like we might have woken up to the insanity of plundering renewable resources in unsustainable ways, but actually what we did in the late 80s, early 90s was basically max out and get to the point where the fish stocks couldn't produce any more than what we were taking, and in some cases we've pushed it too far, as is the case in the Grand Banks cod stock cod fishery where the stocks collapsed in the late 1980s as a result of overfishing. So what I'm showing you is a series of graphics that broadly point in the same direction, linked to massive growing consumption and demand from humankind. And now I'm going to show you a graphic that probably sums up everything I showed you before. And this is basically the mass extinction of animals and plants that's now gathering pace. This, for me, is more terrifying even than the climate change because this literally is irreversible. And this is down to a range of pressures, agriculture, forestry, urbanization, the effects of invasive species overexploitation. You can cut these numbers in different ways, and there's loads of people in Cambridge doing that. Fantastic analysis, but you finish up with this kind of curve when you start to put the data into one place, and you can split it up amongst the different animals that we've got data for. And again, this is unprecedented, and the extent of it, considering how we've not described life on Earth yet, we can only approximate as to what the likely numbers are, but certainly this is shaping up to be an extinction on a scale not seen on Earth for millions of years, the last time possibly the moment when the dinosaurs went extinct. Now, this is a really important moment just to pause and just think about how the world reacts to things like this, because I spent a lot of my career sharing this with politicians, trying to get them to do things about it, trying to get it into the media. And of course, if you really pare back everything that's said, all the technical arguments and everything else, this is still regarded by our society as the price of progress. Anything that gets in the way of economic growth is to be cast aside because jobs, the increase of incomes, competitiveness is more important than flattening that curve. That's the position we're in. And of course, this is one of the most monumental misconceptions in the history of humankind. Because what we're doing here, of course, is we're destroying our economy. What we've not understood is that the biodiversity and the ecosystem services that it sustains actually are the foundation of our wealth. It's not getting in the way of our wealth. This is actually what enables us to live in terms of the productivity of the marine system. It's solar powered. Photosynthesis in microorganisms floating in the sea are sustaining animals like fish and whales in terms of sustaining not only food but tourism. As the sea level rises, our cheapest way of responding is through healthy coastal ecosystems. On land, forests are not only soaking up carbon but protecting us from the effects of floods that are coming in the wake of climate change. Our entire water system is being recycled by nature, yet we're destroying the wetlands that are doing that. The nutrient cycle that sustains plant life on land and in the sea, we've interrupted it and destroyed it by poisoning it with too many artificial sources of artificial nitrogen, at the same time as damaging the soils that would do the job naturally for us. And of course, we're wiping out pollinator populations on an epic scale. So this is a moment for humankind to reflect, because we really are on the edge. I don't think it's any exaggeration to say that this is really a turning point in our history, one that we rise to or not. And it's one that is a question posed to us, particularly as we enter a new geological era, the Anthropocene. So this is a live topic amongst various groups of scientists, deciding not so much any longer whether we have entered a new geological era. We're just exiting the Holocene right now and entering the Anthropocene. The question is not so much if, but at which point did it start? Some people say, well, 50,000 years ago, more or less, we might say, when we wiped out large mammals across Australia and other parts of the world later. 8,000 years ago, the rise of agriculture and cities. Was that the first kind of global impact we caused? Soil changes and the domestication of soils with the rise of agriculture. Was that a moment? Or was it this? This is an interesting one. That same data at the British Antarctic Survey, where you can see a forensic record of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. The CO2 drops in the first decade or so of the 17th century. That was caused by the destruction of the indigenous peoples of the New World and the destruction of societies in Africa by slavery. And as a result of those people dying in their millions, the forests grew back on their farmland, sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere. The fingerprints right there in the ice cores. Or was it later, during the late 1700s, when industrialization began? Or was it, as those curves I've just showed you, starting in the middle of the 20th century, around 1950, when you see that great acceleration, it's called, all those curves coming together into this potentially perfect storm of change. Temperature, population, CO2, GDP, extinctions, demand for natural resources. This is where I think we should mark the beginning of the Anthropocene in the period called the Great Acceleration. And if this is truly marked by a mass extinction, which it may be, then perhaps we should reflect on what we might see in the future geological record as a little layer of iridium across the entire planet, marking the so-called KT boundary, where the dinosaurs went extinct as a result of the collision between the Earth and an asteroid. One wonders if we might find 60 million years hence a layer of microplastics smothering the Earth as a result of our consumption and ill-judged choices as we used up planet Earth's finite resources. Earth Overshoot Day, this is a couple of years ago now. Point is that gets a couple of days earlier every year. This is the amount of renewable resources the Earth can provide in a year, and at what date in that year we've used up our year's worth of soil productivity, carbon space, water supply. Actually, this doesn't include carbon, it would be much earlier. But the point is that Earth Overshoot Day in 2016 was the 8th of August. For the rest of that year, we were running up an overdraft. Looking at mid-century, with all the trends I just showed you, Earth Overshoot Day by 2050 is likely to be around early April. So what are we going to do? It's always an important question when giving a few slides like this. Well, the first thing we need to do is to recognise that what we're dealing with is an interconnected systems level problem. It's not an environmental problem. We have to start seeing the connections between different bits of the system. This is just a little simple idea to give you a flavour of what I'm talking about. This is the relationship between rising demand for food. Arguably, some people say we're going to want 50% more by 2030. You can argue with that, but actually demand is rising. Whether it means more food or less waste is a different argument. More energy, 40% by 2030. Probably will need a lot more energy, more people getting connected. More water. Well, if we're going to produce more food, then of course we need more water. And if we're going to be looking to the risks that come with that, of course, drought is going to be causing issues for for food, but also for the energy supply. I was in Ivory Coast last summer on a research trip looking at the cocoa sector there, and was struck by the vulnerability of that country to drought, not only in respect of food supply and exports of its most valuable commodity, but a hydroelectric dam that was being built there was potentially going to be unable to run because the river flow was dropping. And the river flow was dropping because they'd cut the forest down to make more space for cocoa. These things all start to come together. Food, water, energy, all in one landscape, all fundamentally joined together. What's the business case for change? It's very powerful. The cocoa company and the hydropower company should be cooperating to work with the smallholders to put the forest back. They're not doing it yet because they've not spotted that it's actually a systems level problem they're dealing with. Each of them is dealing with their own little narrow set of issues. How do you foster that kind of system level approach? Part of it's about mapping risk. So here we are, the World Economic Forum, a couple of years ago, just setting out what they think are the sources of risk beginning to appear in the world right now. Some of these things are beginning to join up. It's a controversial remark to make, but there is some evidence, for example, that the Syrian conflict was sparked by a long-term drought linked to climate change back in 2010. Some of the data is beginning to line up around some of these connections as the system starts to show multiple signs of stress. And of course, as it's showing multiple signs of stress, we need more integrated approaches, including from the leaders of organizations like the World Economic Forum, who come together as heads of state. Donald Trump is there today. Don't hold out much hope for much attention to this, unfortunately, but he won't be there forever. And one hopes that he and his successors can begin to grasp the extent to which this is a major problem with multiple internal connections. But of course, for people like Donald Trump, actually he's a very good example of what happens in the next slide as we try to map a forward route to this. This is about the trust in society amongst the four institutions of government, business, media and NGOs. And basically what's going on here is that these people, the government, the business, the media and the NGOs, these are the people who are trying to solve the problem. The extent to which they're trusted is going down amongst people who are not those elite groups. This is Donald Trump, actually. He managed to convince the people who don't trust the elite to vote for him. And this is part of the challenge we have in navigating that system-level challenge. Who's going to command the trust to be able to get people to go on the journey to be able to solve that equation? One equation there, energy, food and water. What's the policy mix in there? As soon as I start talking about that stuff as an environmentalist, people will present it as somehow against the interests of the people. You want to put up energy prices. You're trying to make food more expensive. Water should be free. Those are the kinds of political arguments that come back. So in order to be able to solve the systems level challenge, we're going to have to work in here as well as with science. We're also going to have to start being a bit more creative in terms of how we deploy policy. So one of the things that I've been challenged with on lectures like this for years, I put population in this one, it is obviously an issue, but when I don't talk about it, people say, what are you going to do about population? The implication, of course, is that you've got to stop people having children. It's often an old person who asks the question, going back to my earlier slides. We don't go into that very often. But the point is that the idea is somehow we're going to stop people having children, it's going to be contraception, it's going to be some kind of birth control. Actually, this is where we need to start seeing positive synergies. This gives you a graphic relating on the one side adult female literacy down here and family size over there. Basically, if you can't read or write, you have bigger families. If you can read or write, you tend to have read and write, you have smaller families. It's a simple thing. Why is the world not investing vast amounts of money in basic education, secondary education, tertiary education, particularly in the developing countries? Recently had a seminar with a group of World Bank colleagues a few years ago, actually, and we asked them what would be the thing that the World Bank could do that could deal with all the things we just showed us. We showed them similar slides deck to the one I just showed you. They said invest in education, especially for young women and girls. Still, it isn't happening, but it could do. And also what we could be doing is harnessing the incredible innovative capacity of organisations, companies and people. So here's a little graphic just giving us a sense of how the world has changed over recent years. From the period of the Industrial Revolution, going from water power to steam, to electrification, to the space age, to the digital world we're in now. Where are we heading next? The sixth wave of innovation, some people call it. Radical resource efficiency, circular economy, ecological agriculture with restorative impacts on soils and biodiversity, restoration of fish stocks, radical efficiency in the use of energy using digital technologies, renewable everything. We can do that linked with a program of global education. Perhaps we can start to close some of those trust gaps, spreading prosperity through new technologies and new ideas about how we organise ourselves. And it's already beginning to happen, actually. There's plenty of good news out there already in terms of the scale and pace of certain sectors beginning to grow. And every time I show these slides, they're more out of date. Renewable energy has gone way past what the International Energy Agency was projecting in that slide I showed you earlier on. And the reason for that is because of the innovation that's caused massive price efficiencies. In 2014, renewable energy became cheaper than fossil fuels in some geographies, at least for solar. It's amazing. Why would you want to build a coal-fired power station when it's now cheaper to use renewables? This is the world we're just entering. The question is, in these early decades of the Anthropocene, can we make this go far enough and fast enough? And what's going to be the political deal to do it? But everywhere we look, we can see that solutions are upon us. That is a power station. It's a piece of glass. Imagine a glass office building being constructed in a couple of years' time, covered with that. This has got a structure inside that casts the light to the edges and is captured in solar photovoltaic around the outside, generating a lot of electricity on the side of a glass building. These are the kinds of technologies that are with us very nearly now. And in terms of the way in which we get the political momentum, well, some of this stuff is already laid out. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change is one framework. We have this, the Sustainable Development Goals package, setting out action that's needed on all of these subjects that I've talked about, backed by 168 individual targets. That framework, the Paris framework, and we hope and pray a new framework that will be agreed in China in 2020 for the conservation and restoration of nature and biodiversity, could start to put us into a completely different place. It could happen. And what's going to take us there, I think, more powerfully than anything else, is a new way of looking at our world, a new mindset. And actually, this is a seamless and unintended handover to the next lecture here, Kate Rayworth. Barbara mentioned she's coming here to lecture quite soon, and we'll talk much more about this idea, which is a great idea that she had, the idea of so-called donut economics. And the idea of donut economics is that we need to drive our impact, our decisions, our policies into the sustainable economic development space. That would mean respecting the boundaries we see in relation to climate change, water use, acidification of the oceans, atmospheric pollution, biodiversity loss, and all the rest. We can quantify those more or less, and we know what level we need to respect them at. And we also know, because all of us in this room know it personally, is that we all like health, food, water, income, education, having a voice, jobs, energy, social equality. If we can build that social foundation at the same time as constructing the ecological ceiling, then we have a bright future in the Anthropocene. This is the exam question for planet Earth right now, and I would encourage you all to look deeply into what you might do to help make that happen. Thank you very much indeed. I'll go back there.
Sit up, or do you want to listen to him down?
Okay, go there.
Well, that was brilliant, terrifying, and ideally just a bit more hopeful at the end. But I think we've all got to work at it. I mean, and particularly, obviously, young people, because, you know, they are going to rule the world that we've got to do this in. Now, but let me not go on. Let me introduce our second speaker. We're very privileged to have a visiting scholar at Christ's College, actually, but here as a fellow in the Centre for Science and Policy. He was the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at the University of California in San Diego, and still an emeritus professor there, and was actually a vice-chancellor at some period of his time. But besides his academic work, he was also spent a period of time in NASA, and has also spent a rather large proportion of his life trying to get committees and bodies to do things, I think, nationally and internationally. Professor Charlie Kennel is just going to talk to us for a few minutes about giving us his reactions to Tony's very emotionally moving in various ways talk. Go on, Charlie, all yours.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back. I actually gave a lecture in, I think, 2007 at this series, and I hope I don't repeat myself. First of all, I think we should all congratulate Tony Juniper. I have never seen a more complete account of all of the intertwined factors that lead to the present sustainable crisis that we face. I've also never seen it said so quickly. I think what you get from his lecture is that we have a complex, intertwined, systemic issue involving society's relationship to nature and humans' relationships to each other that we need to solve in order to get through this. And so the question is, what shall we do? And my question in this complex world that we live in is, how shall we think about what we will do? And As an academic, then, I believe I've spent some time trying to figure out what our responsibility in the academic and research world may be. So let me start back a bit. A few years ago, one of my committees I chaired for the National Academy of Sciences, the Board on Sustainable Development, and its foundational document was created by a committee led by my predecessor at Scripps, Ed Freeman. And this was a document, one of the best studies ever done by the Academy, called Our Common Journey. And it laid forth, set forth at that time what these great people thought were the intellectual content, the research issues that were brought up by the commitment to sustainable development that Gro Brundtland had brought to the world some 15 years before that. Now, this is a very moving document, but one of my colleagues, the great Bill Clark, a policy student a policy professor at the Kennedy School, started becoming very anxious. What kind of department should we put sustainability in the university? Is there a department of sustainability? And if so, can the university hold it together? And so my next foray into this area was as the director of Environment and Sustainability Initiative at the University of California, San Diego, and my colleague, now Cambridge colleague, Paul Linden, and I finally arrived at the following formulation. Sustainability is something that universities do. Universities are committed to healthcare, and they devote research and translational research and technology development and even service delivery. They have an end-to-end commitment to enhancing the health of the population. So I developed the mantra at Scripps that we're like a medical school, only we have one patient. It's called the planet. So the next encounter I had with this issue was, Tony mentioned bending the curve. Well, this was the title of an initiative taken by the entire University of California just a few years back. Janet Napolitano, a great president, has committed UC, not CU, but UC, to becoming entirely carbon neutral by 2025, including induced carbon consumption. This may or may not be achievable, but the other thing that she did was declare that the intellectual resources of the entire university, 10 campuses, 2 national laboratories, and the like, shall be devoted to solving the problems of climate change and its impact on sustainability. And she formed a 50-person committee, and that set forth a strategy for climate change and where the university should, what issues should the university focus its topics, its attention on. And it set forth 10 separate goals, which I will not repeat, but only to say to you that only 2 of them are scientific. And the remaining goals all involve the human issues associated with accomplishing the sustainability transition. And they ended up with several ground rules for the work that they do. The first is, thou shalt not think about a climate solution or a sustainability solution that is not scalable, that can't spread. Doesn't do any good if you can't make it potentially global. And the second remark had to do with basic human motivation. Any scalable solution will have 2 components, short-term benefits and long-term benefits. So do not invent solutions that depend on long-term altruism. Deal with the present at the same time that you deal with the future. Now, this is the topic, then, of some of the work that I've been participating here in Cambridge at the different centers. The Center for Science and Policy, that's an obvious need, clearly, in a world like this. But I'd also like to speak of a new center, the Center for the Study of Existential Risk, which was initiated by Hugh Price, the Bertrand Russell Professor of Philosophy, and Martin Rees. Now, existential risk. Now, you may think existential risk is climate change, or it's water depletion, or perhaps it's an asteroid that comes to the planet and wipes out our existence. But that's not really the meaning of existential risk that they have in mind. We are thinking beings. And it is the case that in an Anthropocene, where our actions determine the fate of the planet, at second remove, what we think today will determine the fate of the planet tomorrow. So we contain within ourselves, as our existence as thinking people, the necessity to think appropriately about the future. And this is again where the question of the relationship between the short term and the long term comes in. And what they want to do is develop a new mindset that will deal with issues like these, and at the same time implant in contemporary decision-making processes a respect for the future that we also grant today, the respect for the historical background of our decisions, and make the future and the past come together in contemporary action. So the new mindset, universities around the world have to do their share in developing it, but it is not unique to us. And the final place where I believe academics have played some role was in one of the most impactful conference that I ever attended, and this was the great workshop in the Vatican that helped prepare some of the intellectual background of the Pope's great encyclical about climate change. Now, the essential point was that discussion added to the need for action, and it added to the need for accurate and coherent thought. It added yet another dimension, and this was human sympathy. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we understood from this discussion, after all the great experts went through in 5 days what Tony just did in 1 hour. They were great academics, that's why it took so long. At the end of that time, we all concluded that unless there was a change in human sympathy for each other, then we would not prevail. And so it is that the society that takes care and thinks about its people will also be the society that cares for its environment, and is that society that has to live symbiotically with our planet. So that's what in a nutshell, what I've learned in playing in the academic world in this area for a few years. Thank you. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. A glass of
You sit
water.
over there, yeah.
I'll go and sit. No, I will.
Good, yeah. Well, that's absolutely fantastic. And I think the most cheering thing, of course, is to remember that there are people in America, like University of California, who are actually doing an awful lot on climate change. It's very cheering at the moment to hear that. You keep having to remember there's an awful lot of people in the US who are doing an awful lot on this.
There's only one person who isn't.
Yeah. Now, I want to move on to comments and questions from you, and I want to start with a student, because that's what I always do here. Would you like to stand up? And you can, and in all these cases, you can just ask either of them a question or get both of them to comment. We don't mind. But go for it if you like to stand and
stand up.
Yeah.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. My question was around the idea of acceptance of reality and how does one go about myth busting? Because you're right to point out that everything in society is very interconnected, but people often tend to forget that and isolate all the factors. How does one go about, whether you're an academic or a politician or just a student, convincing not just governments but even the most poorest person living in a rural village to not migrate to the city and not work in a coal factory and accept the reality of this in the situation that we face with so much economic inequality? Yeah.
Good question.
Yes, it is. So what have I learnt on these subjects over the years in relation to that? So one thing I've learnt is that in Cambridge of an evening doing a lecture, this stuff is interesting to most people, but these kinds of facts, they've got very limited travel in wider society. And so what we have to do is translate a lot of these facts and sources of information into things that are much more about feelings and ideas for people than they are in their raw form. And so one of the mistakes that we made, and I put my hand up a little bit on this myself in the UK environment movement 15 years ago, was the unrelenting negativity that came with the climate change message. And what that did was to lay very fertile ground for denial. So if I went on the Today programme with Nigel Lawson, there were quite a lot more people who were prepared to believe him because it just sounded so awful. Thank goodness someone's saying it's not true, I believe him. It makes me feel better. That's what happened. And so with this stuff, we've got to be slightly careful outside the rarefied confines of a Cambridge college in terms of how we bring this to the public. And one of the things we have to do is paint a very positive picture for how responding to this is going to make a better world. That's what it comes down to. And so there's lots of different ways of doing that. But I think that's the communications challenge. And actually that's the big front line of this now. I don't think it's really the data. We've got loads. It's about how we're going to put this into the public discussion in a way where people are going to want to respond to it. And actually the other thing there is what people want to do. We all have interests, whether they're interested with our family, with our jobs, with our economic future. And we have to line up what we want people to do with their interests, because most people won't do things that are bad for them. And this is why Donald Trump did quite well with coal miners on climate change. He told them they're going to keep the coal mines open because climate change is not real. He appealed to their interests and they went with him. So how do we line up all of this stuff with what might be, broadly speaking, the interests of a majority of people, which in a democracy you need to do anything?
I couldn't agree more, actually, that connecting to human sympathy is absolutely essential. I loved it when
you said that. This is where it goes, isn't it?
Yeah, and finally you have to be ultimately humane and care about one another and the society that we live in. And once that shines through, then perhaps the story will be carried along with it. And the other comment I'd make is, the process of social change, particularly in democracy, is very mysterious. You can go along for years thinking certain things will never happen, but people are talking and they're discussing and they're having their opinions and their impressions. And gradually, if you keep saying these things and keep bringing it up in different ways in which it affects people, then suddenly there can be a rapid change. And the rapid change can occur very quickly, and the most recent one is in the perception now of renewable fuels.
Yeah.
Suddenly, there's more world investment in new renewable fuel infrastructure than there is in oil and gas. That's a big change in perception. It happened like that, 3-4 years. But before that, people were saying it and talking about it, and there was resistance, and perhaps even the resistance and the conflict that was so painful to the advocates ended up being important to the process because it enlivened people to the importance of the problem. Now, I always said the denialists were the ones that really understood how big the problem is.
Who did
the denialists are the ones who understand how big the problem is.
Yes, they're very clever.
Yeah.
Now, I'm going to let some more people in. I'm going to take 3 at a time so we get some more people in. So can I have hands up across? Got one on the front and one right up on the back, and a third over this side anywhere? Oh, yes, a man in the middle, please. Yeah. Do you want to say who you are as well when you're speaking?
My name is Nina. I'm a retired person, but I've worked at the United Nations for many years, for the United Nations Development Programme, and I do a lot of as a systems analyst, so I'm very familiar with this concepts of having to look at the whole system and all the interactions with everything in a systemic way to understand how the overall system works. My question is very simple, really. It's about this whole very deeply ingrained concept of competition that we have in our society, and how do we overcome that?
Okay, that's one. Anna at the front, we've got another mic. You've got it, go on, Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Barford. I'm a fellow here at Murray Edwards, and I'm a geographer. I wanted to follow up on Nilufer's point about, how can we kind of bring people along with us? Because clearly the big question here is social change and behavioural change. Obviously, technology is an important part, but we need to change our behaviour and our aspirations. And I really appreciated your point that we do need to do this in a positive way to kind of take people along with you. And I just wanted to mention a book that I read a long time ago by an organisation called Bioregional Solutions. And they set out a table of what you could do to continue to engage in the type of lifestyle we have now, but in a not quite so intensive way. So the idea was that you could still take one international flight, but every 2 years perhaps, and you could still drive, but maybe only twice a week, or, you know, kind of, so people weren't feeling like, if I'm going to be an environmentalist and address climate change, I need to completely disengage from the entirety of the society that I'm live in and my friends are in and my family's in. And for me, I found that quite a helpful way of thinking about it, that it's not an all or nothing sort of question. It's more of a, you know, let's just scale back, change what we're aspiring to. But you can still, you don't have to cut off everything. Thank you.
And the third one in the middle. Up there.
Hi, thanks for a brilliant lecture. My name is Matt George. I'm a researcher and writer. What confuses me is the rich own so much compared to the poverty. I mean, the richest will or even fill a double-decker bus. Don't they have the most to lose? But that does not seem to actually parlay into events. They just continue to mine, build, develop, abuse, but they have the most to lose. Secondly, on this aspect is we're entering a fourth or the fifth industrial revolution with artificial intelligence coming on stream much faster than we thought. Would that change any of this scenario, which is still very much doom and gloom? Thank you.
Okay, now you can go at any or all of that.
Any or all of that.
Competition, bringing people along gradually, and the last bit.
Yeah, so the competition thing, I think it's so embedded in the idea of growth that I think probably the answer to that is about trying to get some different approach to what we're measuring. And so, you know, at the moment we're driven by this idea of how much the economy grew in the last quarter. It dominates the headlines, it's so pervasive, and governments are always trying to line up whatever they're doing in terms of their spending, legislation, policy choices, trying to increase that. And I think that is really quite a fundamental bit of the problem. And so, you know, and again it goes back to what Charlie was saying actually, this stuff sounded a bit mad 10 years ago, but there's now serious economists talking about, you know, what we might measure instead, which for me would be human well-being and happiness, long lives at low environmental cost. If we started measuring that, we wouldn't have competition as the main thing we're trying to do. We'd have cooperation.
I think on their measure, Bhutan is the happiest country in the world, isn't that right?
Yes, they set out to, yes, exactly. And so the king there, actually, talking of democracy, that's one place it isn't a democracy, but definitely a benign dictator who said gross national happiness was his policy goal. And so he set out to do that. And it just takes you in a completely different direction, depending on what you're measuring, you know, what are we succeeding at? So I think that's my answer to that one. On this question of the, you know, how we get people to go on the journey, I think there's a big debate amongst the environmentalists going on for a few years now about whether we take our views and values and try and give people them, or whether we work with people's existing values and try and work with that and change behaviour through working with what people already think. I'm one of the latter advocates in the sense that, you know, we don't have the time, and actually most people don't like being told that they're wrong. They like being told that there's something they can do which is good. And so that question, it just opens up a different kind of dialogue. So the bioregional stuff you talked about, One Planet Living, WWF did a load of work on that, Friends of the Earth had a very similar view. What we found is all great stuff, but it appeals to about 10% of people. The other 90%, they don't quite get it, and they don't quite like it. What they do like, though, is a very fast car. So if you are Elon Musk and you take the latter view, you don't tell people that their car's polluting, you give them something much nicer, which, if it's powered by wind or solar power, is zero emissions, which is what he did with his Tesla brand. He didn't tell people anything about climate change, he gave them a better car than the one they had. I think there's definitely something in that in terms of how we try and paint the picture of the future. We're going somewhere better. And it's like, it's about solving problems. A lot of us will know that, but for many people, they're not interested in that.
That was part of the university's goals, that no solution for the future works unless it has a benefit for the present. No one will support it. So I've heard another kind of issue that I'll put in my own terms, and you'll forgive me if I didn't answer a specific question, but I often get a question after a somewhat depressing accounting of this. What can I do? And the people who ask that question know that if you end a talk on a pessimistic note, and without saying what people can do, they won't listen to the rest. It's very important that people understand there are things that we can do. But after that, the next question comes up, what can I do? I'm just one person, or I just have a limited acquaintanceship, or I have one business. And it's just a drop in the bucket. And so this is where I think the mysterious processes that do lead ultimately to social change come in, because it's your personal witness that you are expressing through these actions. And they are tiny. But if they attract human sympathy and other people, then they are scalable and propagate. And from time to time, you will see a major change in attitudes. And it's because people individually took them and communicated with one another. And
yes, I totally agree. And don't underestimate the power of just spreading some of these ideas amongst your friends and family. Because a lot of what goes on, as you say, in society, it might take a few years for some of this stuff to percolate through. But every now and again, you get it popping up. Most surprising places. So our Royal Secretary of State for the Environment, Michael Gove, the other day, started saying stuff which I thought, where did he get that from? And it's been percolating for quite a long time, and then it pops out in the most strange places. Be welcomed. I know it is strange.
Good. Now,
it needs to propagate a bit further in the United States.
It's a start.
Now, I'm really sorry about this, but we are getting to 25 to 7, and I think we have to bring this to an end. But I was going to maybe take some more, but actually I think they've just come to a very perfect end with those answers to slightly unanswered, unput questions, but about what can you do and does it make any difference? And I think that's the real thing to end on, which is that we all can do things. That there was a wonderful thing back in my time in Oxfam, where it was the National Trust actually, who was doing it a bit with us as well, which was saying to government, we will if you will. We'll take actions if you'll do your part in this and take actions. And that was a very neat way of putting it, actually, which is your thing, Charlie, about, if people do things, then somehow it propagates in the environment. And then, actually, and if you actually say then, come on, you politicians, we're all doing it, what a great way to go. So that's been very frustrating that it's not long enough, but really a great evening. I mean, two superb speakers, and I love the point that we keep coming back to the humanness of all this, and actually the care and concern for each other as the way to do it. So thank you all very much. There's drinks outside, and you can grab these two for a few minutes at least, if you haven't, because I'm sure they've got lots of questions to them. But a big round of applause to say thank you to them.
Well, that was good.